Who's ready to break down the top 100 players in fantasy football from the past 24 years? I know that I am. Let's get to it. Welcome back to the Dynasty Nerds YouTube page. A little bit of housekeeping before we get from players 100 to 91. I want to explain a little bit of the process and kind of everything that went into it. So there was a lot of math that was involved. I started with the quarterbacks and I went through every quarterback that was a quarterback one since the year 2000. How many times they did it, and if they were a top 3 guy, 1 overall, just a top 12, charted all of that stuff. Did the same thing at running back, only we did running back 1s and 2s. Wide receivers, 1s and 2s. So that means top 24 guys at both of those positions. And then tight end for the top 6 guys. Now, where they rank as far as either being number 1 overall or maybe outside of the top 6 or outside of the top 12, those types of things, it affect their scoring for that season. So they got a point number for that season on how high they finished. Then what that allowed me to do is kind of evenly weigh the longevity of someone's career, somebody that did fairly well for a long time, but also factor it against guys that had an amazing peak where they might have only had 2-3 seasons, but those 2 or 3 seasons were super elite. So that helped kind of weigh those things together. Obviously, the guys towards the top, they have both. They had the longevity, but that long-term career, there was a high output that entire time. So there was a lot of that. But then there was also a little bit of me tweaking here and there. Guys that moved up a little bit because of certain things, down because of certain things. And I'll explain some of those as I go. So overall, it was a very data-driven process, but there is still some of my own subjectivity that I sprinkled on top to get guys in or out of certain spots here and there. None of them moved a lot. None of them moved far away from the data, but maybe 3 or 4 spots here or there. So without further ado, let's get into it. Player number 100 on our list of the 100 greatest players of the 2000s is none other than Mr. C.D. Lamb. That's right. He just made the cut, and it's because of this incredible season that he had this past year. That's right. He was the number 1 overall wide receiver this past season, ahead of guys like A.J. Brown, Puka Nacua, Tyreek Hill, all guys that just had monster seasons. He outperformed them all. He had an unreal year paired with Dak Prescott, and he was so consistent all year long. But that's not all. He had another wide receiver 1 season on his resume just from the year before, and both of his 2 years since he was a rookie, those were both wide receiver 2 seasons. So the trajectory that he's on is telling me that he's going to move up quite a bit on this list. But I could only go with the data that I had so far, and that data was really good. And so for him to crack the list after only having 4 seasons, there's not many other players that young on this list that were able to make it, because you need a lot of time, longevity, at least a few wide receiver 1, running back 1 seasons to be able to get on this list. So for him to make it already, pretty special player. He's going to move up quite a bit though in a few years, but for right now, he is Mr. 100. At 99, we have the captain, Captain Kirk Cousins. Thing that surprised me a little bit when I was digging into his data, since he became a starter in 2015, he only had 1 season outside of this injury-plagued one that took him out early. Other than that, only 1 season where he was not a quarterback 1. All of his other seasons, he was at least a QB 1. Now, you're saying, well, if he's been that good and that consistent overall, why is he here at 99? Shouldn't he be a little bit higher? Well, the problem is the peak for Kirk Cousins hasn't been super high. He's had 2 seasons where he's been inside the top 6, but the highest mark of all of those was a season where he finished as quarterback 5. And while that's fantastic, getting a quarterback 5 overall season is great, and having a lot of quarterback 1 seasons is great. But to really climb this list, you have to have quite a few seasons inside of that top 6, top 3, and being the number 1 overall quarterback. So He didn't have quite enough on the resume to move him up higher, but being here at 99, he's our first quarterback in the list of top 100. All right, this guy goes back to really the beginning of the 2000s here. He was drafted in the year 2000, and as a first-round pick, 7th overall selection, the beginning of his career didn't start out super hot. We've got Thomas Jones here. See, the first 4 or 5 seasons of his career, not so great. But in year 5, he went from the Arizona Cardinals to the Chicago Bears, and that's when things drastically changed. In his years with the Chicago Bears and the New York Jets, he had 6 straight seasons where he was either a running back 1 or a running back 2. 6 straight. That's great consistency that you're getting out of a running back. And you don't always see that out of that position with all the injuries and all the things that pile up. So 6 straight seasons as an RB1 or 2, and 4 of those, he was an RB1. Now, he, like Kirk Cousins, didn't quite hit that pinnacle that you're looking for. He had 1 season as RB6, but that's the highest mark he hit. So while he had a good stretch, he didn't quite hit that top tier, and that's what keeps him down here in the 90s. But still, very, very talented running back, and a guy that I think often gets overlooked for his accomplishments in fantasy football. If you've been playing fantasy football any length of time, you probably remember the rise of this player, and that's Devonta Freeman. Yes, the Atlanta Falcons running back, 4th-round selection, and his rookie campaign didn't really get to do much. But after that, the dude absolutely took off. In his second year, that's right, his second season, he went from nothing to being the number 1 overall running back in fantasy. Had a monster 2015 campaign. And then he was running back 6 just the year later. So 2 running back 1 seasons, both of those being top 6, one of them reaching the peak of number 1 overall. However, things didn't last super long. Only 2 more seasons where he was really even relevant, and those were RB2 seasons. So a guy that was a little bit of a flash in the pan, but man, that flash was pretty good. Here's a fun one. At 96, we've got a wide receiver that started off with the Kansas City Chiefs, but he made his fantasy money with the New Orleans Saints, and that's Mr. Joe Horn. I will never forget when he pulled the cell phone out and was talking on the cell phone. Man, great celebration. One of the top ones. I thought it was a fantastic one, but his fantasy success came later on in his career. It didn't happen right away, but during his time, he had great success under Aaron Brooks and a little bit of Drew Brees as well. 4 wide receiver 1 seasons. That's right. 4 wide receiver 1 seasons. Now, most of those were in the 6 to 12 range, but one of them catapulted all the way in 2004 to the wide receiver 2 overall. And he did that at age 32, not a spring chicken. Unfortunately, after that, he basically fell off, didn't have much to contribute after that point. Did have 1 wide receiver 2 season earlier on in his career. So he had a nice little 5-year stretch. But after that, that was kind of the end of Joe Horn. But imagine what would have happened if he would have been able to have that success in Kansas City as well. We would have seen huge numbers from Joe Horn. If you want to talk about a player that had an absolutely elite peak, you're looking at a guy like David Johnson. David Johnson in 2016, listen to these numbers. He had over 2,000 combined yards between rushing and receiving, 80 receptions, and 20 total touchdowns. Absolutely unreal season from David Johnson in 2016. And that was only his second season. He also had 2 other running back 1 seasons, but the hard part was right after his big season, he had an RB1, low-end RB1 season in his rookie campaign and a low-end RB1 season in 2018. But in 2017, he had an injury, and he just never quite got back to form. Only played 1 game that year, and even his RB1 season was mostly on volume and receptions. Just didn't look like the same player. Despite that, a couple years later, he was involved in one of what many would consider one of the most lopsided trades in NFL history in the David Johnson for DeAndre Hopkins swap. Obviously, the Arizona Cardinals got the better end of that deal, got Nuke Hopkins, and David Johnson was out of the league just a few years later. At 94, we've got Mr. Cooper Kupp. This is a guy that has had a wide receiver 1 overall season, and it was a truly special year once they added Matthew Stafford. That changed everything. Now, he wasn't a guy that hadn't had success before. He had a wide receiver 2 seasons a few years before. He actually had a wide receiver 1 season just 2 years before that, where he was wide receiver 4 overall. But that 2021 campaign was just unreal. When we're looking at receptions, yards, Cooper Kupp was just funneled targets, and he always came up with them. Awesome season. Even the year after, despite having an injury-shortened season, still finished as a wide receiver 2. So Cooper Kupp for the Los Angeles Rams, he's a guy that is still playing, still has some time to add to this resume a little bit. Now we'll see. He's not a young pup anymore, but we could see him maybe climb into 80s or 70s, depending on how these next couple years go. Number 93, this player basically had an entire draft class traded for him. Heisman Trophy winner, Mr. Ricky Williams. Ricky had a very, very interesting career. He had some good seasons with the New Orleans Saints, had some good seasons with the Miami Dolphins, but just never quite lived up to that expectation of all of those draft selections given up for him and all of the expectations for fantasy football. Despite that, he's not as big of a bust as people would think. He made our top 100 list, and he had several seasons where he was a running back 1. And in fact, he had 4 of them and was running back 3 overall in 2002. Now, something a little bit odd, he was the running back. He had a running back 1 season in 2004. Then waited all the way until 2009 for his next running back 1 season. Ricky Williams, truly a talented player. Maybe there was some extracurricular things that he enjoyed doing that maybe or maybe did not help him in his career. But overall, you can't deny that he was a special, special talent and still had some very good seasons in fantasy football. We're nearing the end of the episode, just 2 guys left, and let's get our first tight end off the board. It's Mr. Zach Ertz. Zach Ertz, he had 5 seasons, and all of those were with the Eagles as well. He also had one of those with the Arizona Cardinals, but 5 seasons where he was a top 6 tight end. See, we didn't bother doing top 12 because after the top 6, those guys all run the same. They're not doing anything special for your fantasy team, but it's those top 6 guys that really seem to set out ahead, and really the top 3 especially. He finished as tight end 2 in 2018. Fantastic pass catcher, has done a lot over his career. Not quite as much as the guy he finished behind in 2018, but still very, very good career for Zach Ertz. Last one for the top players of the 2000s. We're at player number 91, and it's Brett Favre. Now, if he got all of the credit for the 90s stuff that he did as well, he would be significantly higher on this list. But we can only give him credit for what he did in the 2000s. Now, had a very, very long career. And even in those seasons, 2000 all the way through 2009, he had 8. So over those 10 years, 8 of those seasons, he was a QB1. Now, only 2 of those, he had top 6 finishes. So similar to Kirk Cousins in that sense, where he had a good long stretch, but maybe not quite the peak. Now, we know his peak. He had an amazing peak in the 90s where he was just dominating the league. But still, this late in his career, still had such a good finish to his career, even with the Minnesota Vikings, to where we're able to call him a top 100 player of the 2000s, even though he would also be a top 100 player of the 90s as well. So well done. Fantastic career for Brett Favre. He comes in at 91. Guys, we have lots more videos coming. We're going to drop 10 players at a time and count us all the way down to the top guys. So comment below, who do you think is going to be in our next video? Our guys that are 90 to 81. And of course, we want to know, who do you think made that illustrious top 10 list? We'll see you guys again soon.